It's February the 26th, Media Center, Ukraine. I'm Svetlana Chiparenko, and today we'll have the presentation and the follow-up discussion on Belarus 2025 and forecasts of relevant political processes. The author, Ihar Tyshkevich, will present this report. Hi. Hello. This is not just a forecast, but a survey. Let me start with the background. At the first slide, you can see that, first of all, I would like to thank the people who shared the donations for the Belarus version of this report. So that was a pilot whether we can do an analytical product with crowdfunding, and it did happen. So thank you. And secondly, thank you, Delova Stolitsa, Business Capital, that was in charge of the Ukrainian version. So today is a brief Ukrainian presentation. By tonight, we'll have the Belarus PDF version, and those online. You might not see everything on the screen. You have the presentation printed at A3 format, so please take a look. Let's start. So let's start. Right now, Belarus is on the crossroads. That's why this presentation is called Belarus at the Crossroads in Belarus language. Choosing where to go, because on the one hand, we have the formative circa 2020 and the political crisis that still continues, but also there were a couple of stages when the logic changed. So let's start with the background, how the logic changed around the perception of Belarus. If you look at the protests of the year 2020, the situation was quite weird indeed, because what happened in Belarus, firstly, the Belarus society is very much segmented, and some of the segments of the society were outside of the politics. There was some social agreement that the government allows people to earn money and the society doesn't ask uncomfortable questions, that's all. But 2020 changed that metrics, and the segments of the society that previously were apolitical came into the politics, and you cannot corral them out of the politics at all. That was mostly an emotional development. And unfortunately, I was right that back in August 2020, I mentioned that this is the final electoral cycle of Lukashenko, because these protests would not lead to anything substantial. I thought that I was wrong at that time, but unfortunately I was right. So looking back, the Republic of Belarus tried to balance out the Russian influence, and the beginning of the protests didn't create any substantial reaction from EU and US, because the first package, substantial package of sanctions happened in 2021, while in 2020, people around Lukashenko had the first task, mobilizing their fans, and it's more than 3%, but definitely not the majority. And that's the tragedy of Lukashenko of 2019, because in this report you'll have the link to other polls sociological approach about the Belarus identity. So, speaking about the segments of Belarus society, one of the segments is Soviet Belarus people, and that's the metrics of their thinking. That's the main fan base of Lukashenko. And in 2019, we had 50+%, but since then, year in, year out, it dwindles, and the latest poll shows that the Russian Belarus segment is 34%, one third, but definitely not the predominant majority. And the rhetorics of Lukashenko about tractor and women only works to them and caters to them, not other people at all. And another interesting social stratum came into existence in Belarus, middle class. So apolitical, but what's different with middle class? They know how to ask questions, and people who have funds. So the third surprise for Lukashenko was the ability to capitalize on the situation when some political movements came into existence from grassroots funding. Belarus solidarity, donations, that phenomenon. So 2020 was the year that brought some problems to Lukashenko. Firstly, how to stabilize the perception of his legitimacy, at least among his fans, because the political crisis is won by those who believe that they constitute the majority. That's what he had to achieve. Secondly, how to prevent the opponents to come to neutral groups and to achieve self-funding. So the chronology of first repressions, we can see the suppression, sending the opposition abroad or behind the bars, and mass media, of course. First of all, they started with local press. Everybody reads local press, the owners of businesses and employees, and then large mass media who were sectoral. So his job was to cut those bridges, like repressions against the donations, and that was the first wave of repressions. But the alternative was to let it go. And in Belarus realities, the window of opportunity was late August, early September, when people were congregating on the central downtown square. But then you need to have proper managers at the low and middle levels of the authorities. And that's the problem for Lukashenko. With 20+ years of autocracy, he didn't have that responsible ladder, because it was not who merits to be appointed, but the one who are loyal. So when the critical mass of loyal but not very bright people came to those positions, they don't play difficult and complicated games. It's all about for them to involve the police force, brute force, and that's it. The situation has not stabilized. The crisis went deeper. And finally, another factor, the Russian Federation, and those who followed the events in Belarus probably noticed that the Russian mass media on August 17th and 19th, not on the 9th, but 17th and 19th. Before that, they were mostly promoting a position that was opposing to Lukashenko. Look what Lukashenko stated in August 12th, 13th, and 14th, when he was telling to Belarus OMON, the crowd control people, Lukashenko will run and you would be hung. But the position of the Russian Federation was quite straightforward indeed. Namely, when your satellite can get off your orbit, you can stay successful when you disperse the authority in that country and make it weak. Any authority, democratic or autocratic, doesn't matter. And that's how Russia got involved in Belarus process on behalf of Lukashenko. On the 17th, he said, "I'm ready," and on the 19th, there was the meeting between him and Putin. And Russia was all in favor of degradation of the authority vertical, and among other things, this policy required the transformation of the system of authorities in the Republic of Belarus. Let me remind you about another fact. The first talks about the changes into constitution happened not in the years 2020 or 2021. No. The working group, the task force, was created in early 2019, and when Lukashenko said, "Oh, I boast that I have the draft constitution on my table," that was late 2019. But it's just that this particular person loves power and is afraid of sharing it with anybody else. So it was all delayed, but then September 2020, Lavrov made a statement. Russia expects political reforms in the new constitution. And so when they did that, all Lukashenko could do, fast transformation and transit of power, which he didn't want to, or agree with Russia and integrate with them. So the second happened. And since they didn't start domestic dialogue, it was substituted with the wave of repressions. And until 2022, the key logic in Lukashenko was to ramp up terror and fear, prevent self-funding, prevent new leaders or the institutionalization from coming into existence. On the other hand, finally, there was such a phenomenon as Belarus political immigration. Lots of people still argue how many of them there are out there. Different figures are given, but if you look at the labor migration 29 and before, well, as of mid-2024, we're talking about 240,000. More than it could have been. But there are more than 600,000 Belarus people live abroad right now. So the difference between 2020 and 2021, we had a couple of political Belarus centers arranged in Lithuania, in Poland. Well, it exists in Poland, just got strengthened. Ukraine, of course, and then in Georgia, as paradoxically as it sounds. Well, Batumchik is how they call people who reside, Belarus people who reside in the city of Batumi in Georgia. So the next interesting situation, the strengthening of the Russian Federation. Because for the Kremlin, they don't care what happens domestically. What's important for them to preserve their influence. And in 2021, Russia tried to compensate the Western sanctions that were introduced, and next year it only improved. Why? Because the market demands. And so, as a result, more than 60% of Belarus exports and imports, they come and go to Russia, unfortunately. The investments in industrial production, especially after year 2022, when Russia needed industrial production ramped up. And if you look at the Harvard Atlas of Economic Difficulties, Russia is ranked 60, Belarus is in top 40. So some of the industrial production was needed. Another fun fact, end 21, early 22, which external analysts don't recall that much. Let me remind you about refunding of Belarus debt. This refunding for atomic power plants, and another one, refinancing of the state debt that was supposed to be repaid in the years 2021 and 22. So from the statements of the prime ministers, we know that that's what was happening, but I haven't received any documentary evidence, but it was giving the restructuring of the debt, letting the Belarus repay most of the debt in the years 25, 27. And there's another interesting provision there. So prolonging the and setting the repayment at some later periods of time will allow Russia to demand to pay the whole amount of the debt, the whole principal. So that was the Russian plan. If you're under the threat of paying the principal, $7 billion plus, well, that's painful for a small country like us just to find this amount of funds. So that was the debt trap of Russia that is still on and will continue to reduce the ability of Minsk to maneuver. On the other hand, it will allow Belarus to find somebody else who would back them up if something goes wrong. After 2022, yeah, that's all about nuclear weapons. It's all about influence on Belarus. And it's not even about whether Belarus really have the nuclear weapons available at the territory. It's all about how the armed forces perceive that. Let's remember how the U.S. Diplomats visited Ukraine early 90s when they told Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Ukraine, well, why being independent? You have Belarus memorandum stay as democratic republics within Russia. So the first call with any democratic changes in Belarus will not happen to Minsk, but to Moscow when they would ask, so how about your nuclear weapons now? Next is the information influence. After 2022, when the transit over Ukraine was impossible, it was all about the control over the logistics, because Belarus has access to seaports only through the territory of Russia, and manually Russia can control the flow of commodities. So manually you can do that. Now, and oil and gas, of course. So on the one hand, military force that Lukashenko boasts so much, like Russia is behind us. On the other hand, he recognizes that it's also a military threat to the country. Now, about the balancing act in Belarus, another play comes in, China. In 2011, when there was a previous wave of pressure from Russia, China was not present. But since then, they launched the concept of small friend over large friend, when they choose a small economy and start building relations fast. So Belarus was involved in that, and China became an active player, drawing attention of U.S. to 2018 and 19 to Belarus, not because Belarus was so important, but because China was present there already. And 2020 and 2021, China's position was to support Lukashenko. Then there was a pause in 21-22. The old projects on, no new ones. And then there was change in Belarus in 22, and again, let's look what happened in 2022. The aggression against Ukraine started. On the one hand, there was some logic behind what Lukashenko did to retain power, of course. We know the date when the aggression started, but we forget that in 2 days' time there was a voting on the new constitution, which basically changed the power, introducing Iranian model, and they call it the Council of Elders. In Belarus, it's called the Presidium, but this Iranian model allows some elements of democracy at the grassroots level if the elders set the strategy. And that was an attempt to introduce the same model. And for Lukashenko, it was important that nobody would get involved. Well, Russia was busy with Ukraine, and there was another important thing for Ukrainians, that in 2021, a key change happened in how Belarus treated Ukraine. For the first time, Minsk started with political opponents of the ruling authorities of Ukraine. So before the invasion, Lukashenko had 6 meetings with Viktor Medvedchuk, the traitor, almost once a month, more frequently than with Putla. They would meet either in Minsk or in St. Petersburg. Yeah, that was the plan that the authorities in Ukraine will be changed with Medvedchuk's regime, that Ukraine will give up in 3 days' time, and then you can balance with the new authorities. But that's not what's happened. So, on the one hand, this year gave 2 additional years for ramping up repressions, but it also created some factors that, among other things, limit his politics and give him the points of national consensus. Well, let me remind you what we started with: segmentation of Belarus society. Segments that are different because of different values, but there are some points that both opponents and most of his fans agree on. First one, the Belarus army should not fight against Ukraine, 85%. Second, Belarus should remain an independent state. And so, yeah, on the one hand, the repression started because Lukashenko was very much afraid of activists and the attempts of various insurgent actions. He was scared, for sure. But it also limited the pro-Russian stance. So the year 2022 was an attempt to distance, like entering the grain deal. But let's remember how Russia then reacted. That's military force to you. The ability of transiting Ukrainian grain through Belarus. In August, Kyiv and Minsk started talking to, but 2 days later, Russian 2 air crafts started shooting their missiles over the territory of Belarus. Who would consider them as serious partners? Then September time, at the UN, the same issue was raised, and then again, Russia started firing their missiles from their jets flying over the territory of Belarus. But China still wants us to remain a small friend. And the first claim in September, when Belarus was invited to enter the Shanghai Six, and when the political level of cooperation between China and Belarus was artificially increased at the level of strategic, all-rounded cooperation. And there are 2 playbooks here. One claiming that Russia is number 1, but another playbook is Pakistan and China is number 1. That was the signal sent to Putla. And in 2023, the official Minsk believed that they have all set, and some of the China demands were not met, and then there was cold shower. Let me remind you about Road and Belt Initiative Summit, where a large delegation from Belarus was supposed to attend, but nobody came because Beijing recommended that boys and girls, we don't want to see you here at all. And this cold shower worked. That's when they signed 8 international agreements that Belarus delayed on economic free zone, on cooperation, etc. And the activization started in 2024. And the starting point was the meeting early 2024, but there's another date, important one, which is not about Belarus but Poland, when President Duda met Xi Jinping, Comrade Xi. They talked about Belarus in 2 days' time. They stated that new foreign ministers appointed, some of the government officials, especially in the president's office, were changed. There were statements made about pardoning political prisoners, but the repressions continued. That's important. But in parallel, it was also the attempt to normalize relations with Poland. Migration crisis, right? Illegal migrants crossing the Belarus-Polish border. So come July 2024, and I would like to thank the border guards of Poland, because come July 2024, the number of attempts went down, and by number of magnitude. 2,000 a day, 400 a day is now. It's a couple of dozens. Well, there will be an increase of 200 to 300 a day. But China saw that Minsk is listening to them, and the Minister of Industry, the military of Minister, between July and August, at that level, minister and above, there were 13 meetings of Belarus officials with their Chinese counterparts, 8 visits to Minsk, and back to China, the rest. So now China is the party that is involved in this race, for sure. Now, the situation in 2024, and why it's so important. The factor of China and the fact that Russia is trying to bring Belarus tighter into its grip. If we look at the old way of assessing the stability of political system, legitimacy, resource base, external support, so legitimacy among the population, yes, it exists, but it's temporary, because Lukashenko has used the war format and catered to lack of desire of Belarusian people to fight. So he tries to present himself as a person who would not involve Belarus people into this war. So the electoral campaign in 2025, he felt, okay, of course not 80 plus percent of votes were cast for him, but it's not deep political crisis on the so there was some improvement of his perception, because there was still some crisis in the Belarus opposition. So no domestic conflicts, no long-term strategy, no vision of how to fight the authorities, and that cuts the connections with Belarus people living in-house. And Chatham House says now, those in favor of Lukashenko, 33%, in favor of opposition, 13%, 50% are neutral. So, once again, the legitimacy of Lukashenko is not acknowledging him to be one of his own. It's just selecting the best of the worst, because when the war is over, what's next? So, okay, you claimed no war, okay, no, well, the war started, what then? There is the request for domestic dialogue involving Belarus business, because business needs normal business relations with its neighbors. Without that, in the time of the crisis, yeah, you can persevere, but what's next? Again, negative dynamics. Economic resources. Yes, the Belarus economics demonstrated some increase thanks to Russia, but they started optimizing their social expenditures, and if 66% of your trade is with Russia and they stop buying your things, that's crisis. And that's the reason why the elections happen so fast. Before it all becomes obvious. And organizational speaking, it's all about human capital, upgrading the system. In the time of repressions, you don't have any organizational resource because only loyal, not smart people that make the career, and the managerial crisis goes deeper. Ideological uh, stance, non-existent, and external support. Yeah, it comes from Russia now, but it might be cut off. And usually when you have more than two negative factors, that calls it uncontrolled crisis. So the authorities exist because there is no one who will kill them off. And the system of Lukashenko currently is on the crossroads. Either you enter the unmanageable crisis or you try to stabilize things. But stabilization is difficult. It requires you to change your politics and policies. And the Belarus authorities are bringing themselves into the trap. So the new constitution finally was passed, right? And we forget one thing. According to that's Article 86, it starts with the words, the president of Belarus cannot sit in other positions, but the president of Belarus is also the head of all Belarusian national assembly, and he violates his own constitution, the transit constitution, and now there will be the collisions that you are violating your own constitution that you passed in 2022, because the constitution becomes valid 10 days after it's been published, and it was published long, long time ago. Second, legal collision is redistribution of authorities between parliaments, governments, and the president. So it was all about Lukashenko becoming the elder, but then he basically cut off some of his authorities, but he loves his power. And finally, no ideological or sociological stabilization. What has changed since 2024? The position of external players. For Russia, it's important that Belarus stays deeper in the Russian sphere of influence, and it accepts all the options except for new political force coming into existence, when the whole Belarus might become an active player. For US, Belarus is not even on the map of the world, just indirectly because of its partners in the Eastern Europe and presence of China exists. So any factor that takes off the headache of what to do with Belarus, agree with Lukashenko or not, that's US to you, unfortunately. Another acceptable option is to trade Belarus independence if it's globally needed. For the EU, unfortunately, there is the politics of pressuring the regime. But if we look at the EU at large, that's the policy of waiting. It's not proactive position at all. For China, it's independence and stabilization of situation and hopefully getting out of the conflict with the neighbors. Because if you wanted them to be part of Road and Belt, that means that Belarus should trade with everyone, all of its neighbors. For Belarus, for Poland, it's important that Belarus stays independent. Of course, some conflicts will exist, which is okay for two peoples that coexisted for so long time, but then the issue of cooperating with Lukashenko, getting to the good old times. This is a toxic option for sure. Playing with their own centers of influence. Well, Poland might return to that policy. For Lithuania, on the one hand, it's all about the Richini of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who is not as successful as she used to be. And another thing, Lithuanian elites are afraid of the phenomenon that is called Lithuanization. So unlike Poland, the format of proxy state under Russia influence is acceptable, because then we talk only about the threat from Russia, and then you can work with Belarus. Turkey is a future active player, being the regional superpower, but this player will be influential starting late this year only, most likely even in 26. Ukraine, yeah. Independence of Belarus is important, but unfortunately Ukraine doesn't have a consistent policy in respect to Belarus. 2020 invite Belarus, 2021 pressure them out. Now there are at least 3 concepts of what to do with Belarus. Come on, if the elites cannot agree with the unified policy, there will be no unified policy. So until Ukraine shapes its unified vision, most likely it will remain a supervisor, an observer, a fly on the wall. Unfortunately, Ukraine is not yet a strong political center of influence. And finally, key scenarios of how the events might evolve. Even 6 months ago, there were 2 key scenarios: transit plus annexation and proxy state. Transit plus annexation, paradoxically enough, is the reason that Lukashenko cannot get out away from Russia, because then it will be transit to somebody else, and annexation. Proxy state, that's one of the most probable scenarios, when either there is an agreement of Belarus elites, you can see 20%, right? Shows that Belarus elites will give up, surrender, or when the Republic of Belarus will try to negotiate around the events in Ukraine, not a player in bilateral Ukraine-Russian negotiations, but regionally. But again, there are, let's not forget, US and China. So one of the other options, hypothetically, to be included into the peacekeeping force, but that failed. And next, conflict between US and China is another option. And assuming that China will not use us as its country of influence. Proxy states, well, that's all about repressions, because transit and annexation, if the war continues, there will be aggression guaranteed from the territory of Belarus against Ukraine, but proxy state increases this probability, military attacks, and unfortunately, Belarus remains a headache for the whole region and the whole world. Or trying to play on the orbit of Russia, artificially getting to 2017, not 2019, when the best times for Lukashenko happened, but then 2020 happened. So 2017 is impossible by default, because he claimed that nothing will attack Ukraine from Belarus, but it's happened. So 2017, there was still the opportunity for maneuver, and there were interests of European neighbors, partially Ukraine, but there was US and China attempt to get Belarus out of the orbit of influence of Russia, but it will not happen overnight. The debt, the Russian military force, brute force. So the best case scenario for Minsk is to find some common grounds with Western countries to expect better scenario next year, when some technocrats will come to Lukashenko's orbit, less influence of military, reduction of repressions, but not complete stop to them. Even when we talk about Belarus going away from Russia, Lukashenko will continue the repressions. But he might keep it at the uh, difficult to notice level and starting some sort of possible dialogue within the society, but it's not guaranteed. And it's important who will be involved in the dialogue. On the one hand, it might be one of the subject groups in immigration, and it should not be a political group compulsory. That's why Lukashenko spent so much on the regiment of Kalinovsky, because that's how the Belarus opposition changed since 2020. Finally, there is a player who has the ability to dethrone him, not only with weapons and arms, but it's a different level of potential planning, because the army always have military planning. It's not about those who get the grants based on what report you write. No, if you fail with your military force, you die. So, unfortunately, still, such political player as, well, we don't have any clear political opponents finalized. It might be Warsaw Group or Vienna Group, and to stabilize the situation for Lukashenko, reaching other social groups, he needs political projects similar to New People of Nechayev, formalistically liberals but fully under control. And we have our couple of Nechayevs, Protasevich, Nepatsky, and others. Let's see who makes the political career, because then it will be Venezuela scenario. Juan Guaido problem started when the Maduro created the parliament, and for 7 months the speaker was an old dissident who was the former anti-Chavez activist. And then they said, well, Guaido is no longer the president, but one of the leaders. In our format, yeah, we have this Venezuelan algorithm that could be presented by the official Minsk. Actually 3 options of getting away from Russia fast. I hear use Roosevelt's phrase, he's a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. What he said about Somoza back then. But now it could only possible under Trump. Trump, who doesn't care what would be inside the country, all he does starts forcing the relations on us. But the probability is about 3%. At each decision-making point, the probability is different. I believe that everything is 50-50. 80% probability, though, finding balancing act, but 20% is give up to Russia completely. Everything else are floating numbers, and the Trump alliance is not that probable. If the war goes on and Russia faces the economic downfall and tries to absorb Belarus even deeper, but then China will get in and compensate it all. And look at the conflict between US and China now. So 2 options then. Either Belarus quickly gets into the Chinese sphere of influence, and look at what happened with Uzbekistan, who was under the dominating Russia influence, and then he would be talking not about the Russians with the quality seal, but with the Chinese with the quality seal, and the probability is not that high. But looking at the future conflicts between Washington and Beijing, I place it at about 3% as well. And there is a Far East vector of development, with the focus on BRICS, SHOS, Chinese, Vietnamese, and Turkish factors. And then, yes, Belarus will try to balance out the influence of Russia. And I'm talking about only this year, 25, thanks to this eastern vector. Another vector, direct ties with China, which will most likely assume that some domestic dialogue will start. Another low probability scenario, asteroid falls on Moscow or in Minsk, or sudden death of Lukashenko, then it's the transit plus annexation scenario most likely kicks in. And another low probability scenario is sudden capitulation of Ukraine, because that's just unrealistic. A detailed description of scenarios you could find in printed version, Belarusian language version tonight, and Delovaya Stolitsa publication will publish it in Ukrainian by end of this week. So here's QR code, and if you were interested in this presentation, we have Rehabilitation Center Lanka, funded by Belarus people who help international soldiers fighting for Ukraine in rehabilitating them. Because since they have no homelands to get back to, especially Belarus soldiers, so those of you who would like to fund that and who would like to thank me for this presentation, please scan and help people to take care of our soldiers. Thank you, Igor. So if you have any questions, comments, please raise your hand and join the discussion. In the context of US, as you said, they don't care about Belarus that much, but were there any political actions from the previous administration to prevent this option? Yeah, Trump's administration is favorable to Lukashenko. When Pompeo came to Minsk, when the U.S. Energy Department helping to build the power plant there stated that why not? Let's cooperate with fuel. But then Mr. Kushner has some family ties to Belarus. Also, Trump doesn't care about any institutional evolution. He likes face-to-face talks. And there are some signals from Minsk, like the recent visit of U.S. State Department on political prisoners, then releasing Ihar Tyshkevich, U.S. citizen, who now is called not a prisoner, but an American attorney. So there are some signals from Minsk. There was the visit of U.S. official. Happens. Probably they will start talking about the trade soon. What could Lukashenko suggest to stop helping Russia? But probably he will play a dirty game of plastic waste. Remember when China stopped accepting American plastic, and then Chinese communists became bad. But when Vietnam started accepting plastic, then Vietnamese communists became good. Probably something similar could be theoretically offered, but whether US would follow up on that. Thank you. What about the Chinese factor? You just said that relations with Belarus, with China, were cooled down. No, they were cooled down, but they now go up. Before the presidential election in the States, Lukashenko was supposed to visit Xi, Comrade Xi. It didn't happen. I won't tell you the region. But that's what the doctor prescribed. The doctor prescribed to stay at home. Who was that doctor? Make a wild guess, but this visit is still possible. Future cooperation is possible. But again, for Beijing, if worst case scenario Belarus becomes proxy state, then they will not be proactive. Beijing will be proactive only when there is some domestic activities, and not only Lukashenko becomes proactive now, but his opposition also tries to contact Beijing, something that never happened in the last 15 years of Belarus-Chinese relations. Whether the opponents, the opposition, will try to capitalize on that, well, we'll have to see. So, Belarus and Chinese were building something similar to Patriot missiles. So, cooperation in military production, was it slowed down? Russia wants those technologies and the production units. No. And as of today, China has a complete ban on transfer of technologies, but if China joins Russia, then it will be changed overnight. But there is still so-called Belarus-style book air defense systems. And 6 months ago, the memorandum on cooperation was signed for new types of armament systems. Nobody knows what particular armament systems. Igor, today the Council of Federations in so-called Russia ratified the agreements on the guarantees of security. That's one of the basic agreements that Russia signs with Belarus. And the Russian Federation builds a network of buffer zones. So cooperating in security, coordination of international security, like part of this memorandum, becoming part of the common union and security guarantees, all that is very dangerous for Belarus for sure. But for the time being, this document does not contain 100% guarantees that Russia will involve Belarus in this war, but unfortunately it contains in other documents. When the Lukashenko's retinue contributed to changing the military doctrine of the Republic of Belarus, which says that the aggression against Russian Federation is treated as the aggression against Belarus. Nobody forced them to draft that, but they did. And now it's part of our laws. These are very dangerous documents indeed. Could they be compensated? Yes. Either when reformatting the regional relations, like look at what Armenia is trying to do now, or the format of changing the terminology, which the Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan are trying to do by changing the ODKB with SHUS, even though there's still Russian involvement, but through the Shanghai arrangements. You can no longer call those relations Russian relations, they're rather Chinese. Whether Belarus people believe that or not, well, it might happen differently. It's all about another Belarus person who likes to change his position because he loves his power. Let me remind you, at the beginning of the war of Russia against Ukraine, he said, I'll show you where Russia was planning to attack us at. And then he said, no, Russians just went through, they never told me that it would happen. Well, remember what Lukashenko said late 2022, that Zelensky is a vermin, and how he calls him in late 2024, esteemed Volodymyr Alexandrovich. So he can sway and change his political position. He did it before so many times already. On the transit of power. So, your forecast. Opposition abroad, some hand-picked person from among his retinue. Remember, a couple of days ago, he stated that he does not assign the government, that is the tradition of Belarus, to vote for hundreds of days. So whom the power would be transited to? Let me put it this way. If Lukashenko agrees to that, by the way, another constitutional collision that he doesn't remember, the new constitution finally says that no one can be president for two straight terms. The first ended in 25, the new one started. So the question to him now is, so this is your constitution, what would you do with it? But it's all about the different things altogether. It's not about the public figure in high government positions who is ready for that, but who among the Belarus officials comment both tracks, Russian and China. There are three such officials right now, so possibly they might be involved in the transit. As for the transit itself, initially the attempt would be to reach agreements face to face if the economic situation stays stable and Belarus opposition stays in crisis. Because if a new player comes in, which could change the position of Belarus in respect of its relations with the neighbors, Poland and Ukraine, then that means Minsk will talk with that opposition leader only because they require relations with those neighbors. I haven't mentioned Lithuania because of the interpersonal conflict, firstly. Secondly, uh, Tikhanovskaya is not treated seriously. And Chinese factor. Lithuania is in conflict with China. And until this diplomatic conflict is over, until they find some common grounds, nobody would become friends with Lithuanians because Comrade C would hate it. Only if China says, yeah, go ahead. So that's what causes. So the transit of power, and in 2025, what's the probability that similar thing would happen when the grain deal was disrupted by sending their jets, launching their missiles, Russians launching their missiles over the territory of Belarus, thus disrupting any such agreements? Yeah, probability is high. Because talking about transit, let me reiterate, 2025 is not about the transit happening in this year. The only thing that might happen, if this happens, if the threat of annexation looms over us. In all the other cases, it would happen at least starting next year because of the psychology of Lukashenko. But if there is a progress of distancing Belarus from Russia, then there is high probability that Russia will launch some provocations, which what they do, and then Minsk stops being a subject. Yes, there would be signals from Minsk that, hey guys, it's not us, but who would believe Lukashenko? So, unfortunately, since he is speaking in Belarus language, I'm not able to understand all he's saying. Thank you. Any other takers of the microphone? No hands raised. So thank you so much. And Mr. Ihar, thank you. We discussed the focus of political processes in Belarus this year. Media Center Ukraine team works out. Sorry, I would like to thank Media Center Ukraine so much for giving the opportunity to present this report here, and we are so grateful to you. Thank you and your team. Thank you. Ihar, we'll gladly see you some more here. Thank you. Stay with us.